The Gemara asks a question. Esther min ha-Torah minayim. Where do we find the source for Esther in the Torah? Now, all of us, at least the least bit familiar with Jewish history, know that the story of Esther took place a long time after the giving of the Torah. So when the Talmud asks the question, Esther min ha-Torah minayim, how is it possible that Esther can have a source in Torah? Of course, Esther, the story of Esther and the Jewish people came after the book and before the movie, but the movie was based on the book. So we have to understand what the question was, Esther min ha-Torah minayim. The Gemara answers, you know where Esther is found in the Torah? The Torah says in the Tochacha, in the rebuke, Chi astir ponai mikem, I will hide my face from you. And the word Esther means hidden, lahastir. Her real name was Hadassah Greenblatt. Right? It was really Hadassah, the Gemara says. Greenblatt I just made up. But her real name was Hadassah. But she was given the name Esther. And Esther represents the mysterious aspect of her. But it also represents the central theme of Purim. Because there was a great deal of discussion amongst the rabbis whether to include Meggilat Esther in the Bible, in Tanakh. Should it be in or it should be out? One of the big points against it was that in the entire Megillah, the only book of the Bible, in the entire Megillah, the name of God is not mentioned. It's not there. There's no mention of God. But yet, in a word, that's the story of Purim. And we'll see what this means. It's really interesting. There's a chazal, there's a word of the rabbis that tells us that there's one holiday in the year which is like Purim in the Jewish year. I'm not talking about Martin Luther King's birthday. In the Jewish year, there's one holiday that's like Purim. Yom Kippurim. A day like Purim. Right? The word kimo, in the beginning of the word Kippurim, right? A day like Purim. If you could think of any 2 days that are opposite, it's Purim and Yom Kippur. Of course, by the end of Purim, Adelo Yoda, we're so high, you don't know, it's Purim, Yom Kippur, you don't know where you are, what time it is, what day it is. But looking at it from a step back, they're 2 very different days. And yet, the Chazal, the rabbis say there's a similarity between it. What I'd like to discuss tonight, in looking at the Megillah, is what that similarity might be between Purim and Yom Kippurim. Unless you want to answer it right now, and then we could all go home. But I think the answer is will tie things up. It's interesting because Gemara asks another question. Haman min ha-Torah minayim. Where is there a source to Haman from the Torah? Haman, of course, was in the Megillah. He's the bad guy, right? Haman min ha-Torah minayim. Anybody take a guess where you find the word Haman? What? He was from Amalek, but of course he came so many generations later that he would not be referenced in the Chumash. So it's some type of hidden subliminal message where Haman is found. It's found by the Nachash, the snake. You all remember the snake in the Garden of Eden, right? I don't know who played him in the movie, but in the Garden of Eden, Gan Eden, there was a snake. The one that enticed Chava, Eve, to eat from, it wasn't an apple. Right? That's propaganda from Mott's. They want you to believe it was an apple. It helps sell their product. It wasn't an apple. It was, the story of the person who came to the Pope, and from the beer companies, they wanted to change the Lord's Prayer. Give me each day. Give me each day. You haven't been davening. Give me each day. Give me each day. Grant me each day your daily bread. He wanted to change it. Give me each day your daily beer. And the Pope was aghast, and he said, how could you going to disparage the entire liturgy, and it's a disgusting thing, and please go out of here. He says, you're holy see, I'm talking about $250,000 in order to change this. And he said, for $250,000 you expect me to disparage such a basic prayer? And he said, but it's kind of the same, give $500,000. The Holy See said, what are you talking about? That's nothing to us. Give us each day our daily bread is an important part of our religion. He says, your Holy See, I'm authorized to go up to $4.5 million, and that's it. The Pope looks and says, wait a second, I'll be right back. And he goes back to the back room where all of his scholars are sitting and says, check that contract when it ends on Wonder Bread. But whatever Haman tried to get, I'll explain it to you later. Whatever Haman tried to get somehow has to do with a series, it's a parallel to the Nachash, to the snake. What was the motivation of the snake in the Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden? What was the snake's motivation? It wanted to get rid of Adam and Chava. It wanted to get them out of the way. Why? Because the snake was number 2. Right? Somehow in that scale, evolutionary or not, the snake was number 2. And it wanted to be number 1. That's an intrinsic drive within beings, to be number 1, to be primary. If you would imagine for a second that you would multiply your comfort level, your homes, your cars, all the things that make you comfortable, right? Your luxuries. If you can multiply that by 10, right? But everybody else's was multiplied by 50, you'd be miserable. Because everybody else shot up a lot higher than you. So even though you're better off relative to everybody else, you'd be miserable. And I'll tell you one more joke, and then we'll get down to business. Like the story of the woman who was approached by an angel, a heavenly angel, and was told, I'm going to grant you 3 wishes, whatever you want. But there's one little trick in it, and that is, whatever you want, your ex-husband gets double. So she said, all right, big deal. And she asked for $10 million. And she got $10 million, and she was very happy until she heard about her ex-husband getting $20 million, and that threw her. Then one day she was vacationing, and she saw a beautiful boat, a yacht. She said, I want one of those. And she was granted one, and she's sitting on it and enjoying it. Her ex-husband sailed by with one that was twice as big. And she again felt miserable. And finally she turned to the angel and said, could you beat me half to death? Right? But whatever we want, part of what satisfies us is being number 1, being up there. And that was the drive of the Nachash. It was number 2 in the Garden of Eden. But, as they say, they try harder. It wanted to be primary. It needed to be primary. And that, in a word, was Haman's problem. Haman was the king's advisor. He was very respected in the kingdom. And everybody bowed down to him. That's what and who Haman was. One person wouldn't. Mordechai. Not because he didn't like Haman. Not because he called Haman nasty names. Because he said, we believe in God, who is the primary force of all, and man cannot bow down to man. Man does not worship man. Man worships God. And this was not acceptable to Haman. Haman's hatred of the Jews was based upon our belief in the primacy of one God, that there's something above man. And we'll see the connections as we go on, but if you read the biographies of Adolf Hitler, when he writes about the Jews, his conversations, the famous book Conversations with Hitler, where he talks about the Jewish people being a cancer or parasitic to the world because they want to inflict upon the world of a cancer of the belief of a God over man, so that man can never raise himself to total greatness. And this is how he writes. And this was Haman. So Haman is compared to the Nachash, the snake. The need for man to worship himself and be over all, primacy. If you look at the Megillah, we probably won't do too much of the text now. I'll probably just try to give you a general overview. And maybe we can find 1 or 2 interesting things. This was, just to skip around, that primacy, that desire for primacy, had actually begun Haman's downfall. It actually began his downfall. Because the king, as we'll study in a few moments, was of a minority race. He was Persian, and the country was mostly a Babylonian country. It's a confederation of various states, the largest one being Babylonia, which is, the Babylonian Persian kingdom is Iran and Iraq, that central area over there, somewhat east of Brooklyn. And that entire section was a confederation of various republics. This king, Ahasuerus, actually came from a minority republic, from the Persians, as we'll study in a few moments and looking a little bit about the history of it. So he was very, very much upset and obsessed with the fear that somebody would try to overthrow him. Because court intrigue was nothing which was invented then and still continues. Today we have different scapegoats, we use the John Towers of the world. But he was afraid of losing not just his position, but losing his head. And Haman was a man who was without any inhibition to his ambitions. He wanted it all. And he gives himself away, and I'll show you where his downfall begins. His downfall begins on page 107. Balayla Hahu, in the 6th chapter, or in the English, page 108. Balayla Hahu, Nodada Shnat Hamelech. That evening, the sleep of the king was disturbed. And the rabbis tell us that when the king is mentioned in the Megillah, it's not only a reference to the king Achashverosh, but to God. God, whose name is not directly mentioned in this book, only indirectly. What disturbed the sleep of the king, of God? According to the Medrash, it was the children of Mordechai who locked themselves up with their teacher Mordechai. Mordechai had a yeshiva. They locked themselves up with their teacher and said, if Haman is to kill you, we wish to die with you. And their parents were outside of the yeshiva begging them to escape, and they refused. And all night long, they stood by their teacher in prayer and in learning. And the Medrash says this, the cry of the children, that's what woke up the sleep, quote unquote, of God. The refrigerator could probably do it also. It'll quiet down in a minute. No, that's okay. It'll quiet down. Just it's still a little left, Shabbos chillin' left in the refrigerator. It's reacting to it. So Nadad Shnat HaMelech, the king's sleep was disturbed, and God's sleep, God's passiveness at the potential destruction of his children was disturbed. And at this point in chapter 6, everything turns. But first, something happens. The king, Achashverosh, the earthly king, couldn't sleep, right? And he didn't have an old copy of one of my classes that would help, and he didn't have a Saminex. So what did they do? They read the Daily Chronicles to the king. Now, if you really want something boring, take a look at the congressional record, with all the stuff they put into it. You can go to sleep in 4 lines. It's very, very boring. They figured I'll read something boring and I'll go right to sleep. But somehow by coincidence, the advisors, the king's men who were with him, turned. And what did they chance upon? That there was a man named Mordechai, a Jew, who had saved the life of the king from court intrigue. He had saved the life of the king. As the story tells us, Mordechai was sitting by the gate, overheard 2 people discussing their plans to overthrow the king. Mordechai, as a member of the Sanhedrin, was fluent in many, many languages, understood what they were talking about, and reported them to the king to save the king's life. And the king gets up and says, but what was done to honor him? Here's a man who saved my life. Now, unless we do good things to people who saved my life, no one's going to step forward and help and be an ally. What was done? And they said nothing was done. Why was nothing done? Because Mordechai was a Jew. The king says, that's not right. We have to do something. Otherwise, people will not step up to save lives. And he got up very early that morning. He had a very restless sleep. And there was another man out there who also couldn't sleep, who was pacing the corridors outside of the king's anteroom, Haman. He couldn't sleep because it wasn't enough for him to wait for Mordechai to be destroyed amongst all the Jews later on. Right then and there, he wanted Mordechai hanged. He wanted him finished with. The hatred that he had for Mordechai was so invasive, he couldn't be happy and enjoy his victory without the immediate destruction of this man Mordechai. And so he was pacing backwards and forwards, waiting for the king to wake up to ask permission to build the gallows, which already were built, which will play an important role later. And so the king sees that it's Haman out there, and he gets a little bit worried. What's he doing out there so early in the morning? But he calls him in anyway. And he asks him, and this is at the bottom of page 107 or 108, Ma la'asot b'isha she'hamelech hafetz b'yikaro. He asked him, what should we do for the man whom the king wishes to honor? Why did he ask him a question like that? So Haman said to himself, Vayomer Haman b'libo, Haman said to himself, L'miyachbot hamelech la'asot yakar yoter mimeni. Who would the king want to honor more than me? Of course he's talking about me. That's how egocentric this man was. If there's anyone to honor, it's got to be me. Right? You know, you can imagine if Frank Sinatra were playing that role, then he would turn around, it's got to be me, right? He thought the world revolved around him. And the king knew it and asked him that question specifically in that way. Because look at his response. At the very bottom of the page. Let them bring the royal robe which the king has worn. And the horse which the king has ridden on. And let him go out with the royal crown upon his head. Let one of the king's officers escort him, proclaiming, let him ride throughout the entire square of the city, proclaiming, thus shall be done to the man whom the king wishes to honor. Look what the Melech, look how the king answers Haman. And tell me what's missing from Haman's idea. Vayomer Hamelech la Haman, and the king says to Haman, Maher, quickly, Kachet halavush v'atasus, take the robe, the clothing, and the horse, Kasher dibarta, as you have said, and do this to Mordechai the Jew who sits, B'shar Hamelech, in the gate of the king. Don't leave out anything from what you have said. What does the king leave out? The crown. He leaves out the crown. No king will allow someone else to wear their crown. Why did the king, who's no dummy, even though he's portrayed as a drunk fool, why was the king making Haman think that it was he that he wanted to honor? You know, if you want to raise a lot of money in Jewish communal activity, you get a lot of people together, a lot of wealthy people together, and you ask them, you know, we're going to honor somebody, the most important person in the community. Who wants to give? And everyone says, oh, they're going to honor me this year, you know. Why did he ask him in this way? He wanted to see what were Haman's ambitions. And when Haman asked for the crown, he began his own downfall. And that downfall continues because at this point, while Mordecai in the beginning of the Megillah is the hero and predominant, at this point Esther takes over. And she devises the plan and implements it. And she was aware of the jealousy of the king. And she, by the way, had never really been a very willing wife. You never see her going to the king. Matter of fact, according to one opinion in the Talmud, she was Mordechai's wife. She and Mordechai were married, according to one opinion in the Talmud. That means that she was a very unwilling wife. And yet, she said, in order to save the Jewish people, I've got to go into the king and make amends. I'm going to invite him to an intimate private party. And how does she invite him? She says, Your Highness, we should have an intimate private party. I'm making a party for you. Just the three of us. You and me and Haman. She says, wait a second, what's Haman doing here? But he accedes to her wishes. And you look in the Megillah, you see how they kind of just drag Haman. The king was not happy with Haman. Drag him to come. Of course, he's very happy to come. And he loves rather than realizing the sensitivities, a smart man would have said, a man whose ego did not consume him, with all due respect, he would have said to Esther, wouldn't it be nicer just you and the king? You know, I would love to come, but no, he came in, you know, oh, here I am. And then the next time there's a party, she does exactly the same thing, and now he's really wondering, and she refuses to tell him what her request is. And it's interesting, and we'll talk about this as well, ad chatzi hamalchus, until half the kingdom, he says, I'll give to you. And the Medrash says, he put a delimiter on it. He said, until, but not including something. There's something you cannot ask for. You cannot ask for the rebuilding of the temple, which is a very strange condition, because he didn't even know she was Jewish. But we'll see what role that plays in a few moments. And then, when finally she turns to the king and says, this man wants to rob me from your household and destroy my people, so the king runs out of the room in anger. Why does he run out of the room? Well, he was angry. Okay, that's one thing. But again, he was checking, is this the signal that they're going to come attack me? And he sees that his loyal soldiers are standing there, and it's just Haman in the room, and he comes back into the room, and he wonders, no, Haman's already a high advisor, has men, has people loyal to him, he has 10 sons who are governors all over the place, a very royal and loyal advisor. Not so smart to, deal with them hastily. But what happens in the meantime? The Megillah says that when the king came back, before the king came back in, Haman realized, hey, I'm in trouble. The queen's out to get me. And turned to the queen, and they were lying on couches. That's how they had their feast. He gets off his and he goes to Esther and starts leaning down to her to plead for his life and say, I never really meant you and your family, and you should know some of my best friends are Jewish, and all the other things that he told her. But he tripped and fell on the couch. So then fell on Esther. So when the king comes back, he says, you want to take her even while I'm in the house? And all of the jealousies that Esther was developing within the king came out in anger against Haman, and he said he should be hanged. And they said, well, there's a gallows out there that he was building for Mordechai who saved your life. And that sealed his fate. He was gone. Finished. The question is, if you look further into the Megillah, you need a little bit of information on the background. Because the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, plays a very important backdrop to the story of Megillat Esther. You should know that the Megillah takes place between the destruction of the first temple and the rebuilding of the second temple. After the destruction of the first temple, when the Jewish people were going to be exiled, there was a prophet among the Jews by the name of Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah. Yirmiyahu was very respected by the Babylonians because everything he prophesied came true. So the Jews gave him a hard time. The Jews threw him in prison. They didn't want to hear, it's not so easy to be a rabbi. Although he had a clear profit motivation, right? Sorry about that. But it was very difficult, and the Jews did not listen to him until it was too late. And the Babylonians offered that he could be allowed to stay in Jerusalem, but he insisted on going into exile with his children. But he said, as he was leaving, we'll be back. At the end of 70 years, the Jewish people will rebuild the Beit HaMikdash, will rebuild the temple. When did the 70 years start? There was a king of Babylonia who took over, whose name was Belshazzar. Right? Belshazzar, now you know why their empire disbanded. Nobody could pronounce their names. They didn't know who to talk to. But Belshazzar figured the 70 years from the time of the previous ruler. Because they used to count years, like start a clean slate. Whenever a new ruler came, so he assumed from the time of the beginning of the previous empire, that's when to count the 70 years. So 70 years rolled around, and the Jewish people were still in exile in Babylonia. And Belshazzar said, God is dead. That special relationship to the Jewish people is gone. And they are lost. And to celebrate the death of God and the predominance of man, he took out the holy vessels from the temple which were captured, and he made an orgy. Like California got a few hot tubs out and whatever. He made a big party, a big orgy, until he literally saw the handwriting on the wall. That's where the expression comes from in the book of Daniel. A hand came out and engraved into the wall the words, Minei Minei Takalu Farsin, which in some acronym meant, you have been measured, weighed, found lacking, and you're going to be punished. That's some way to end the party, right? Belshazzar was afraid. And so in his skewered view of life and death, he told his guards, triple, quadruple the guards surrounding the palace. And if anyone tries to get through, shoot first and ask questions later. Even if the person looks like the king, because we all know, he said, the angel of death can disguise themselves as anyone. And Belshazzar went to sleep, a troubled sleep. They woke up in the middle of the night. Remember in the story of Shemot, how Moshe and Aaron would come to meet Paro in the early morning. Where did they come to meet Paro? Down by the river. You know that old song, Down by the Riverside? Right? They came to meet Paro down by the river, early, even before sunrise in the morning. What was Paro doing down by the river in the darkness of morning? And the answer is, he was taking care of his needs. He was taking care of his needs. Because he told people that there was a myth, that he was a god. He didn't say it was a myth. His father was a god, and I'm a god, and therefore I don't need to deal with human needs as other people do. And of course it wasn't true. And medication can only work so well. And he would take care of his needs early in the morning. And that's where Moshe and Aaron went to meet him and said, we know you're human. Let's stop playing games. There's a real God, and it's not a human being. Belshazzar had the same type of setup. So he didn't have a Nile down there. He had a secret chamber, a secret passageway, which we know that most kings had, for escape, and also led to his own private facilities, his own private washroom hidden deeply into the bush in the outside of his palace. In the middle of the night, the call of nature, and he went outside and took care of his needs. And as he's trepsing back into that secret entranceway in the palace, there were so many guards surrounding the palace that they heard him. And I said, who goes there? And he says, oh, I'm the king, don't worry. And they followed their orders and they killed him. Belshazzar, ironically, killed by his own orders. And they were so proud of themselves. Look what we did. We're going to show him to the king. And they run into the palace and knock on the king's door and open the king's chambers and said, we might have made a mistake. There was a fifth column in Babylonia, the Persians. And they were constantly seeking to avenge themselves and attain control over the empire. And when they heard by their spies that there was disarray in the palace and the king was dead, they rushed in, attacked, easily took over the palace because of its disorganization, and proclaimed themselves the rulers over the Babylonian Persian Empire. And a man by the name of Darius sat on the throne and proclaimed himself the ruler and emperor. There's a little girl, Belshazzar's daughter, who heard all this commotion going on, and she got very upset. And she jumped out of her room and ran down the hall and ran into the throne room and popped on her father's lap. But it wasn't her father. And Darius looked down and saw this little girl whose name was Vashti, and said, "You'll make a," as they say in ancient Babylonian, right? "We'll make a wonderful match for my grandson, whose name is Achashverosh." Because political marriages were done in those days in order to solidify kingdoms together, so that the throne should be jointly occupied by a Persian and a Babylonian. With that in mind, we begin the Megillah. Because the Megillah begins with a party. Achashverosh, 3 years into his reign, makes a party. Why? Because it's exactly 70 years after we turn over the tape. It's exactly 70 years after the destruction of the temple. And again, no sign of God. No sign whatsoever. And so he makes this party. It's interesting to note that there was a time that the Jews were trying to rebuild the temple, and it was the report of Vashti, who was given control over Jerusalem, and the sons of Haman, who at that time were governors over Jerusalem, who stopped the building of the temple. And as Vashti said, it was my grandfather who destroyed the temple, right, and my father who maintained that destruction. You're not doing any building. He was more than happy to comply. He did not want the Jews to rebuild. And when 70 years came, according to his calculation, and no temple, boy, this showed that the Babylonians and the Persians and the non-Jews were right, and the Jews in their faith of God were wrong. There will be no redemption, no coming home. And of course, he also made a mistake from these calculations. And what's very interesting to note is that the irony of it all is that the son that he has with Esther is the Babylonian emperor who gives the Jewish people the permission to rebuild the second temple. Exactly 70 years after the final point of exile, when the king of the Jews, Yechoniah, was exiled from Israel. 70 years exactly from that date, permission was granted for the rebuilding of the temple, the second temple. But Achashverosh made a miscalculation, and he had a party. And he again took out the holy vessels, and the description of the riches and the wealth that he took out in the beginning of the party reflects the vessels of the temple. And there's a custom to read the opening chapter when it talks about the kelim, the vessels. There's a custom to read it in the same tune as Lamentations, as Eicha, that describes the destruction of the temple. The Jewish people at that time had a problem. Should they go to this party or not? Everyone was invited, and everyone was expected to come. And the Jews said, we can't put ourselves in bad graces with the ruling authorities. It's a new kingdom, a new rulership. We have to, it's koach nefesh. We have to raise and rescue our lives. There was one Jewish leader who disagreed, and that was Mordechai. He refused to go to that party. He refused to take part in anything that would desecrate the name of God. But at that moment, the Jewish people sealed their fate by trying to prove to the Babylonians and the Persians, hey, we're as patriotic as you are to the king. They sealed their fate. And that's when, Vayihi b'mei Achashverosh, that's when the book begins. In the word Vayihi, the Talmud says, the word Vayihi is a sign of trouble. Because the outside letters of the word Vayihi are like oy vay, woe, woe. But the inside letters, Yud and Hey, are the name of God. Yud Hey is the name of one of the names of God. And that's the symbol of the Megillah. On the outside it might look treacherous, but you have to have the capability and sometimes the strength to look on the inside and see the presence of God in everything that happens. The other time that it uses the word Vayihi under similar circumstances was Vayihi achar hadvarim ha'eleh, after all of these things, Vayakom melech chodosh al Mitzrayim asher liyadat Yosef. A new king arose in Egypt who did not know Joseph. The beginning of the slavery of the Jews. What began the slavery of the Jewish people in Egypt? The Torah says that when Jacob was alive, he kept the Jews apart from everybody else. They were separate. But what happened when he and his sons died? Vatamale oretzotam, they filled up the land. Wherever there was a party to be had, the Jews made sure they were participating. Wherever there was a neighborhood to be moved into, they had to be there just like everyone else. And Vayihi, when the Jews started forgetting the primacy of their being Jews, Vayakom melech chodosh, that's when the disaster happened in Egypt. And one doesn't have to, again, have really an overwhelming, profound sense of history, but just looking back at previous generations. that the reform movement that began in Germany began with the theme. And if you read the writings of the early reform rabbis, many of them until this date, people like Geiger, Abraham Geiger, and others, their major theme was, why practice all of these things? We don't need Jerusalem, we have Berlin. And if we can drop these antiquities and customs that are primitive, the German people will accept us into the glorious brotherhood of the Reich. And we will join hands in a universal love of each other that will propel the world into total redemption. And that, of course, needs no epilogue. It took people like the anti-Semite Rieger of Vienna to say, "Wer der Jud ist, das ich beschmiede." Who the Jew is, that I decide. So this was the handwriting on our wall when we attended that party. All except for the lonely voice of Mordechai. But it's interesting in that party, based on what we've just learned, to look a little bit about the dynamics between Achashverosh and Vashti. Now remember, Achashverosh was kind of an illegitimate king in the sense that he came from the Persians, while Vashti was descended from the real nobility, the Babylonians. If you look at the Megillah, and it was in the days of Achashverosh, he was Achashverosh who was ruling. It doesn't say yet Achashverosh HaMelech or HaMelech Achashverosh, but he was Melech, he was ruling. And then on line 2, in those days, when the king Achashverosh, in other words, when he started becoming and solidifying his rule and being Melech, you turn to page 91, on the third line down, how is Vashti referred to? But how? Look in the Hebrew. Gam Vashti HaMalko, while the king is Melech Achashverosh, she is Vashti the queen. The difference between Queen Vashti and Vashti the queen is that she was first Vashti, she was a woman, and by right of her being married to the king, she was the queen. Look at the dynamic of how this changes. It says, look at the, let's say about 8 lines down, all of these people who came to as Pnei HaMelech Achashverosh, King Achashverosh, to bring Lahavi as Vashti HaMalko Leftei HaMelech, to bring Vashti the queen before the king, Beketer Malchut, wearing the crown of the queen. Now, of course, she always wore a crown, but the Chazal say that was all he wanted her to wear, just her crown. You think they invented anything in California? Laharot To'amim V'Asorim, why? To show off to all of the people and officers et Yafya Ki Tavat Marahi, her beauty, because she was very attractive. He wanted her to parade around like this to say, look, I'm not married to her because she's a Babylonian princess. She's a beautiful woman. That's why I'm married to her. Now look how she refuses. Batima'ain Hamalka Vashti. You notice that switch? And she refused. Who? She said, I'm not just so-and-so. I'm not just someone for you to parade around. I'm Malka Vashti, not Vashti HaMalka. So the king doesn't know what to do. He's angry because now there's this direct confrontation between 2 kingdoms, public. What is she going to do? So the king says, what should we do? And he goes to his advisors, and 6 lines up, or 7 lines up from the bottom, Kedos Malasos B'Malka Vashti. What should we do with the Malka Vashti? In other words, he's recognizing now, it's a statement, he's recognizing that she is not just anybody, she's Malka Vashti. She does have rights to the throne. So Haman, or Memuchan, says, wait, let's not get upset. Avsa Vashti HaMalka. He switches it around again. You can get dizzy with all these switches, but you have to understand why. And if you read the English, you keep saying Queen Vashti and you never get it. But Avsa Vashti HaMalka. Let's call her Vashti HaMalka. She represents the Babylonians versus the Persians. Instead of, let's take it away from the political arena and we'll make it a sexist issue. will give every husband the right to go back to his wife and say, I rule the house. And this will be the sign to husbands. And of course, not unlike today, the men controlled the army and the police force. They had all the weapons. And so insurrection was avoided by making this a man-woman issue. So husbands were able to come home and say, you have to listen to me. Even the king said so by royal decree. Of course, the wife picked up her rolling pin and started running after him. And he ran under the bed and he said, you come out here this instant. And he said, I don't have to listen to you. I'm the boss around here now, right? But what happened was, all the men were shaking their heads like, this is what happens at home. But Memuchan, or Haman, changed the issues around. He made it and took it out of the political arena. That's a backdrop, a very brief backdrop. I want to present one problem to you, one fascinating issue. You heard it on Shabbos, Danny. And that is the nature of Amalek. Because Haman came from Amalek. Amalek is a people from Edom, from the Edomites, who were descendants of Esau, right, the son of Jacob, the bad son of Jacob. And Amalek became the eternal enemy of the Jewish people. This week, as you well know, is Parshat Zachor, where there's a commandment to listen to the destruction, or to listen to the mandate from God of the destruction of Amalek, because Amalek is intrinsic evil. Bad news. Amalek is intrinsic evil. And they're put in the world to test that which is intrinsically good, and for us to be able to uproot ourselves against them. Now, Amalek, we can tell Amalek, the Chazal say, if they're enemies of the Jews, whose hatred of the Jewish people is so great that they'd even go against their best and own interests in order to destroy the Jews, then you know that's Amalek. When Hitler, Yamach Shemo, had a choice towards the end of the war whether or not to use the trains to resupply the German soldiers in the Russian front, or to continue the genocide of the Jewish people, he said all of the trains go for the Jewish people, to destroy them. Even though it meant losing the war. Could have turned things around perhaps. It meant losing the war. Because as he says in Mein Kampf, the greatest war was against the Jews. The Talmud in Megillah says that Edom will have 300 princes coming from them. Right, this is again prior to the first century. That there'll be 300 princes coming from the nation of Edom. And these princes will form into a singular unit that will have the capacity to destroy the world. And the Talmud continues and says that they will form the nation of Germania. This is the Talmud, right? Written in the first century, before the first century. They will form the nation of Germania, which the rabbis throughout history have said, Zehu Germania shel Ashkenaz, the same Germany of Europe. If you know your history of Germany, you know that Germany was a confederation in medieval time of 300 princes and feudal lords. You read the Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, it says it black and white. If you read the encyclopedia, German history, it was a confederation of 300 princes. At one point, the Medrash says that Edom and this nation of Germania are like the pig, Chazir. The Medrash says, you know why? Because the pig sticks its hooves out. Now, there are two characteristics that make an animal kosher. One is an OU, before that. One is split hooves, animal with split hooves, and the other is it chews its cud. Now, a pig has one characteristic, and anytime people go by, it takes off its Adidas, right, and shows its split hooves and says, look, I'm kosher. And yet we know that inside of itself is a low beast that does not chew its cud, and therefore it's not kosher. And the Medrash says that's like this nation of Edom and its descendants. Inside of them will be bloodthirsty animals. outside of them. They'll be polite, efficient, acculturated, moral, quote unquote. And one does not have to tell you that the characteristic of the Germans, that while they were killing Jews, they were washing their hands before they ate and had their cocktails. There's a point in the Megillah in which Esther goes to Achashverosh after the point that we had read. And she says to Achashverosh, she says to the king, give me a day so that I can arm my people and fight against our enemies and hang the 10 sons of Haman. And the king accedes to her wish, and the Megillah quotes that the enemies were killed on that day, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. The next day she comes back to the king and says, Nachamo, one more time. Give us one more day in Shushan, the capital. That's why we have a day later in walled cities like Shushan. The day of Purim is later, Shushan Purim, like in Jerusalem. Give me one more day, she says, to fight our enemy, fight against our enemy, and to hang the 10 sons of Haman. And the question is, they were already hanged the day before. What's she referring to? The understanding is that she was referring to talking to God, the king. And she was saying to God, give us a time in the future when these other descendants of Amalek, like Germania, will come along, and that we should again